It was supposed to be another great family dinner at my apartment, as we usually do, when my son gave me a paper to sign saying it was for the health insurance, and I signed it without reading. I always trusted my son. Later that same night, he started laughing and shouting in my face, "How stupid you are. Now this entire apartment is mine. I want you out of here tomorrow." The next day, his reaction was priceless when he discovered I owned the whole building. That lesson my son will never forget. My name is Anthony, I'm 65 years old, and until that night, I believed I had weathered every storm life could throw at me. I was forged in the hard labor of the construction trade, a mason who pulled all-nighters studying business management, brick by brick, until I had built a small real estate empire. My business acumen was legendary in the neighborhood, but it was my generosity with my family that became my true hallmark. However, that same generosity came with a dangerous tendency to blindly trust the people I love, especially those who carry my blood. For years, I lived under the weight of an internal need to prove my love through financial sacrifices, a vulnerability that I knew might one day cost me dearly. What I didn't know was how high that price would be, nor that it would be collected by the hands of my own son. It all began on a rainy Wednesday, with a seemingly innocent invitation to dinner at his apartment. That day already carried a peculiar melancholy, the grey sky shedding a fine drizzle that blurred the windows and my spirits. Upon entering my son's home, I was struck by a palpable strangeness. Lit candles flickered in every corner, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Soft, almost inaudible music filled the room, and there was even a vase of fresh flowers on the table. All of this was atypical for him, as he never bothered with such details when having me over. The aroma of dinner, mixed with an expensive perfume his girlfriend had sprayed too liberally, hung in the air, heavy and cloying. My relationship with him had cooled considerably since he started dating that young woman. From the first moment, I had the impression she was a gold digger, showing more curiosity about my properties than about our family history or my feelings. Her eyes, which should have shone with affection, seemed to scan the room for value, a silent calculator operating behind a forced smile. He emerged from the kitchen with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a spectacle of white teeth and expression lines that didn't match genuine joy. "Dad, I need you to sign some health insurance papers," he said, pushing a stack of documents across the table. The phrase triggered the unease I was already feeling. I skimmed them, the fine print blurring before my tired eyes. The pages were numerous, and the urgency in his tone was too insistent. My son had always been a master of manipulation, even as a child, when he used emotional blackmail to get what he wanted, be it a toy or permission to go out. I recalled countless times I had given in, driven by a blind love and a naive hope that one day he would mature and see the value of loyalty. At that moment, the day's fatigue, my blurred vision, and the manufactured urgency combined with my old tendency to trust, I signed. After all, what father would suspect his own son? It was a rhetorical question, my soul screamed, but my hand, obedient, scribbled my signature in the indicated space. The moment the ink dried on the paper marked an abrupt change in his behavior. The smile, once false, disappeared completely, replaced by a cold, calculating expression I had never seen on his face before, not even in our moments of greatest disagreement. His eyes, once distant, now stared at me with an almost perverse intensity. "You're a fool, Dad," he laughed cruelly, a sound that cut my heart like glass. Each syllable carried the weight of years of resentment and veiled contempt. "You just signed over the deed to your apartment. Now it's mine. I want you out of here by tomorrow. My girlfriend and I are moving in." The floor seemed to fall out from under me. The apartment I had bought with so much sweat, each brick carrying the weight of my hope, where I raised my son alone after my wife's early passing, was no longer mine. The echo of his words, "You're a fool, Dad," resonated in my mind, a dissonant melody of betrayal. The humiliation burned in my chest like a white-hot poker, a pain deeper than any physical wound. I stood in silence, absorbing the magnitude of the betrayal, processing the cruelty of that revelation. But inside, a storm of emotions was forming, churning the calm waters of my soul. It was anger being born, mixed with sadness and a paralyzing shock. That night, I walked the streets of the neighborhood where I had always lived, my coat heavy with rain and anguish, watching the illuminated windows of the houses, each one representing a home, a security that I had lost. I wondered where I would sleep the next night. The weight of humiliation was suffocating. The idea that at 65 I was being kicked out of my home by my own son, with nowhere to go. The neighborhood where I was respected as a successful man would now be the stage for my shame. That night promised to be the longest of my life, and I had no idea how to face the dawn without a roof over my head, without direction, only with the certainty that the pain of a child's betrayal was the sharpest of all. Dawn arrived, painting the sky a pale gray that mirrored the shade of my soul. The night had been a torturous journey, each hour marked by the reverberation of my son's cruel words. The apartment, once the refuge where my late wife and I had built dreams, was now the stage of an unimaginable betrayal. The weight of humiliation, mixed with the feeling of having been a fool, was crushing me. But behind the excruciating pain, a spark of something stronger began to glow. It wasn't blind rage, but a cold determination. The old cunning that had made me survive and thrive in a world of sharks. I had overcome much bigger obstacles than this, and my own blood would not be my downfall. I took a deep breath, the morning air, still damp from the night's drizzle, filling my lungs and giving me a new perspective. I decided I would not leave this situation as a humiliated beggar. My son expected a complete defeat, a silent surrender. But he didn't know the depths of my resilience. The clock struck 6 in the morning when I rose from the chair where I had spent the night, my bones aching, but my mind sharp. I grabbed a small suitcase, packing only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, important documents, and most crucially, a binder with the records of my properties. The decision to keep my assets quiet, to have bought the entire building, one apartment at a time, without fanfare, now seemed like divine providence. It was my safety net, the last bastion against insolence and greed. The building superintendent, Manny, who had known me for 15 years, probably already knew what was happening, or at least suspected it. His expression when I met him in the lobby was a mixture of pity and confusion, his eyes wide, almost questioning. I went up to my old floor, the floor where my son now considered himself the new king. He and his girlfriend were already there, visibly impatient, anxiety written all over their faces. Their eyes shone with a feverish expectation, a gleam I knew well. The anticipation of having something that wasn't rightfully theirs. She, with her artificial smile and flawless makeup, seemed more radiant than ever, as if her happiness depended on my ruin. My son, standing taller than usual, tried to look confident, but a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the nervousness behind the facade. He looked me up and down, his expression a mix of triumph and disdain. The suitcase in my hand seemed to solidify for them the image of the defeated old man, a man losing his home to the next generation. "You're here already, son," I said, with a serenity that surprised even myself. My voice sounded calm, almost monotone, without a hint of the anger or pain bubbling inside me. That calmness, I realized, disoriented them. They expected shouts, tears, a dramatic confrontation, but I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "The super will be up with the key for you shortly. I've already spoken with him." The words floated in the air, laden with a double meaning that only I understood at that moment. He furrowed his brow, confused, and his girlfriend exchanged a quick glance with him, a wrinkle of suspicion forming between her perfectly drawn eyebrows. The plan was in motion, and the first phase, my apparent submission, had been executed successfully. I watched them, their movements, their expressions. They couldn't possibly know. It was then that the superintendent, Manny, appeared in the hallway, carrying a ring of keys and some papers. His steps were slow and calculated, as if he were performing a rehearsed choreography. He gave me a discreet, almost imperceptible smile, a sign that we were aligned. Manny, a man of few words but unwavering loyalty, had been my confidant in many of my ventures. He approached, and the sound of the keys jingling on the ring seemed amplified in the tense silence of the corridor. My son's face, once confident, began to pale. "Hello, Mr. Anthony. Your apartment upstairs is all ready for you to move in. Sorry about the delay with the renovations," the super said, his voice firm and clear, the tone of a professional carrying out a routine task. The air in the hallway seemed to thin. "What do you mean, the apartment upstairs?" my son stammered, his arrogance quickly replaced by utter confusion, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at his girlfriend, who also seemed to have lost all color in her face. Her jaw slightly dropped. The scene was almost comical, if not for the underlying drama. It was the first crack in their armor of presumption. I allowed myself a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. "What? You didn't know?" I replied calmly, savoring each word, each syllable, the taste of justice beginning to emerge. "Your father owns the entire building." The revelation fell like a bombshell. The words resonated in the hallway, hitting them with the force of a thunderclap. The shock on their faces was undisguisable, a mixture of disbelief and panic. That moment, the turning point, the reversal of roles, was just the beginning. They had no idea of the extent of the web I had woven, nor the trap that had been set. The apartment he had stolen was just the tip of an iceberg of financial complications I had engineered, a poisoned gift meticulously planned to unmask their greed. And what was to come would be even more devastating. The game was just beginning. The revelation of my ownership of the entire building hit my son and his girlfriend like a lightning strike on a clear day. The shock on their faces was a mixture of panic and disbelief, and I watched with bitter satisfaction as the mask of arrogance crumbled. They had underestimated old Anthony, the mason who became a mogul, the father who had prepared for the worst, precisely to protect what was his. The apartment my son thought he had stolen, that piece of concrete and dreams he coveted, was now a poisoned gift. What they didn't know, what he could never have even imagined, was that the property was mortgaged with a massive debt that I had intentionally taken out months before. A carefully woven trap, not out of malice, but out of an instinct for self-preservation, a premonition that their maliciousness had awakened in me. I had sniffed out the greed, felt the heavy air of their intention to swindle me, and I had acted first. In the days that followed, the calm in my new apartment, one floor up, was almost surreal. It was my own home, with an even wider view of the city, a constant reminder that, despite the pain of betrayal, I was still the master of my own destiny. From my new vantage point, I could see the building's facade, imagining the storm that was brewing in the apartment below. My mind, once tormented by humiliation, was now absorbed in a mix of melancholy and a strange kind of relief. Justice, though painful, was beginning to manifest. I allowed myself moments of reflection, feeling the weight of my own cunning. Had I gone too far? The answer, in my soul, was always the same. No, I was just protecting myself. The pain he was feeling was the consequence of his own choices, his own blind greed. During the first week, the bank notices started arriving, an avalanche of letterhead and sealed envelopes that, to me, were just numbers on a statement, but for them would be a sentence. The apartment's overdue property taxes began to surface, and the condo fees piled up, revealing the extent of the financial trap. My son, accustomed to a life of comforts and a fiscal irresponsibility I had always shielded him from, had no idea how to deal with that suffocating bureaucracy. I remembered the times I tried to teach him about the importance of responsibility, of money management, and how he always ignored me, laughing at my obsolete ways and my paranoia about finances. Now, he was reaping what he had sown. Their dream apartment, the one that was supposed to be the stage for their luxurious and carefree lives, quickly turned into a financial nightmare. The phone began to ring incessantly in my apartment, but I knew the calls weren't for me. They were the creditors, the collectors, the bitter reminders of the reality that was setting in. Then, the calls to my own number began. It was my son, his once arrogant voice now choked up, begging for help. "Dad, please, help me. There are some strange bills showing up here. I don't understand," he would say, his voice almost a desperate whisper. I maintained a firm stance, watching from a distance as reality hit them like an avalanche. I couldn't save him from himself at that moment. He needed to feel the weight of his actions. Through a casual conversation with Mrs. Rosa, my neighbor from the floor below, a lady with a keen eye for everything that happened in the building, I learned more about his girlfriend. She had pulled the same scam on other families in the area. Her methods were always the same. She seduced older men or influenced their sons to get properties, then disappeared, leaving behind debts and broken hearts. My son was just another victim on her list, a pawn in her game of manipulation. The revelation brought a new layer of pain. He, whom I had raised with so much love, was being used as an instrument, a means to an end. It didn't lessen the pain of the betrayal, but it added a different kind of bitterness, a lament for his naivety and his vulnerability. Revenge, I realized, had a more bitter taste than I had expected. And the next week promised to be even more challenging for him, as the financial storm was just beginning to gather strength, and the true extent of the debt was about to be revealed. The second week brought with it a palpable intensification of the drama unfolding on the floor below. With each passing day, I could feel my son's apartment vibrating with a growing energy of despair, as if the walls themselves could scream the anguish that filled him. His desperate calls became more frequent, and his voice, once laden with false confidence, was now a lament of pleas and rhetorical questions about what was happening. Every time the intercom buzzed with his number, I felt a tightness in my chest, a complex mixture of paternal pain and the cold satisfaction of seeing justice served. But deep down, the worry for my own son, despite everything, was a constant burden. Through the cracks of daily life in the building, through conversations with other residents, and with the faithful Manny, the super, I discovered even more disturbing details about his girlfriend's scheme. She had not only manipulated him into transferring the apartment, but had also forced him to take out loans using the property as collateral. The revelation hit me with the force of a punch to the gut. He now owed far more than the property was worth, and the creditors, with their serious faces and incisive words, began to show up at the building, looking for the new owner. I remember seeing them from my floor, men in suits carrying briefcases, their expressions hard as they knocked on the apartment door, demanding answers. The facade of prosperity my son had tried to maintain was in ruins. The woman he thought he loved, the same one who had shared his bed and false smiles, had used his greed against me to financially destroy both of us, or more precisely, to destroy him, while I watched the web close in. She had revealed herself to be an experienced con artist, with a history of fraud and manipulation. My son was just another piece on her intricate chessboard of lies. His nightmare worsened when I discovered she had already vanished, taking with her not only the little money he had in his bank account, but also the gold watch my son had inherited from his mother, an object of inestimable sentimental value. That watch was a relic, a piece of my wife's memory, and its loss hurt more than any amount of money. My son was alone, drowning in debt, living in an apartment he couldn't afford, with no prospects for the future. Revenge, though not exactly what I had sought, was complete. But the taste, I realized, was more bitter than I had expected. For a whole week, I watched him from a distance, feeling like an orchestra conductor watching his composition, painful but necessary, unfold. He struggled with reality, which became more crushing each day. My son, who had always been too proud to admit his mistakes, was being publicly humiliated by the creditors who appeared at the building. The collection calls became more aggressive, and the neighbors, who once admired him for his supposed prosperity, now whispered in the hallways, their conversations filled with pity and condemnation. His reputation in the neighborhood plummeted like a stone in a well, each piece of gossip a hammer blow to his already fragile self-esteem. The situation became even more dramatic when I learned, through a conversation with the superi, that my son had tried to sell some furniture to pay off the most urgent debts. Desperation was pushing him to drastic measures. However, he discovered, to his horror, that even the furniture was in her name. Everything had been coldly calculated by the scammer. She had planned every detail of the financial trap, using my own son as bait to get to me, and at the same time, ensuring he would have nothing when she disappeared. The realization of the extent of the manipulation sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a financial scam, it was a masterpiece of cruelty and deceit. I knew the breaking point was near. The moment when my son's mask of pride would finally fall, revealing the open wound of his soul. And when that happened, I would be there, ready to extend a hand, not as a savior, but as a father. The time for suffering, though necessary, was coming to an end. The air in the building seemed to grow denser with each passing day, heavy with the weight of my son's despair. The conversations in the hallways, once mere whispers, were now open declarations of pity and gossip about the imminent ruin of the young man who had it all. My heart, which had hardened itself to endure the pain of betrayal, now began to soften as I watched the downward spiral he was in. It was a cruel irony. While I watched from my new, yet familiar, apartment upstairs, he was drowning in a sea of debt and despair, trapped in a web that, although I had helped create, was woven by the hands of an unscrupulous woman. I could hear the echoes of creditors at his door, the insistent buzz of the intercom, the muffled arguments that filtered through the walls. His face, when I saw him casually in the elevator or the lobby, moments he tried to avoid, ashamed, was paler, his eyes sunken. The spark I had once glimpsed in his youth replaced by an expression of extreme exhaustion and deep melancholy. The proud posture he had always maintained, the image of a successful and self-confident man, had completely vanished, replaced by slumped shoulders and a shuffling walk. Each encounter was a vivid reminder of the transformation that greed and naivety had wrought in him. It was the punishment he needed, but also one that I, as a father, was reluctant to see. The news that reached me through Manny and Mrs. Rosa was increasingly alarming. He was selling what was left of his belongings, designer clothes, electronics, anything he could convert into a few bills to pay the most urgent debts. The luxurious life he had so coveted was falling apart before his eyes, and he was being forced to confront the reality of his situation. Pride, that defining characteristic of his personality, was being crushed, layer by layer. Under the weight of public humiliation, I imagined what he must be thinking, the sleepless nights, the memories of his dream apartment turning into a nightmare. I knew he was alone, isolated, and solitude is sometimes the best teacher. The greatest pain for me was knowing about his mother's watch. That object, more than a material possession, was a link to the past, to the woman who had left me so early and with whom I had raised our son. To see that he had lost even that, not by his own will, but through the cunning of the con artist, was a heavy blow. I saw her greed in every move, in every piece of the plan, and the way she had exploited my son's fragility and ambition to achieve her own ends. It was a bitter lesson, not just for him, but for me as well, about the dangers of blind trust and the way love can sometimes make us vulnerable. I sensed he was at his limit, that the fall had been so deep that the only possible direction was up. At the end of the second week, a soft buzz from my intercom roused me from deep reflection. It wasn't the insistent ring of creditors, nor the desperate call of my son. It was a hesitant, almost imperceptible buzz. I paused for a moment, my heart beating faster in my chest. I knew it was him. When I opened the door, the image before me was of a completely broken man. His hair was disheveled, falling over his forehead. His clothes, once impeccable, were now wrinkled and dirty, and his eyes, once full of arrogance, were red and swollen from crying, revealing weeks of silent suffering. This was no longer the arrogant man who had called me a fool, nor the young man full of grand plans. This was a wounded son, a man who had lost everything except, perhaps, his capacity to feel pain. The pride that had always characterized him had been crushed by the weight of reality, and he seemed to have aged 10 years in just 2 weeks. This moment was the climax of everything I had planned, a turning point not just for him, but for our relationship. I knew the conversation to come would be difficult, but also the most important of our lives. The silence in the hallway was broken only by the sound of his heavy breathing, and I, the father watching him fall apart, knew it was time to extend my hand. The image of my son at the door, broken and vulnerable, instantly erased any remnant of bitter satisfaction I might have felt. The sight of his suffering, so palpable and real, dissolved the hardness I had built in my heart over the past few weeks. His red eyes, his slumped shoulders, his wrinkled clothes, all were living proof of a pain that far surpassed my own hurt. In that instant, I didn't see the manipulator, the ungrateful child, the ambitious schemer. I saw the boy I had raised alone, the son who had once looked at me with admiration, the same one who, in times of childhood purity, had called me his hero. The anger I had nurtured for those 2 weeks dissolved like salt in water, replaced by a deep paternal ache, an overwhelming compassion that brought a lump to my throat. He didn't wait for me to say anything. His voice, once strong and confident, was now a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper. "Dad, forgive me," he pleaded, bowing his head before me like a frightened child seeking refuge. "I was an idiot. She manipulated me, convinced me you were hiding money from me. I thought I deserved more than I was getting. I lost everything. I lost you." Each word was a shard from his soul, a painful confession that laid his vulnerability bare. The admission of having been manipulated, of having been blinded by greed, was a testament to his fall and, paradoxically, a sign of his possible redemption. I watched his every gesture, every tremor in his body, every tear that streamed down his dirty face. He wasn't trying to make excuses, only to confess, and in his voice was a sincerity that touched me deeply. The mention of me hiding money was an echo of the seeds of discord that woman had planted in his mind, exploiting his insecurity and ambition. The truth was, I had never hidden anything, only acted with prudence, protecting my assets and indirectly our family's future. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life, a lesson that no amount of money or material possessions could buy. It was a lesson about values, about trust, about the true meaning of family, and I knew, with a certainty that calmed me, that he needed me more than ever, not to save him, but to guide him. I extended my calloused hand, the same hand that had built buildings and raised a son, and placed it gently on his shoulder. "Get up," I said, my voice soft but firm, echoing the authority of a father who forgives but also demands responsibility. The touch, the word, was the signal he needed. He rose slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and in them I saw a glimpse of that boy I loved so much. In that moment, we decided to rebuild not only his financial situation, but, more importantly, our relationship. The silence that followed was filled with a mutual understanding, a tacit agreement that the past, though painful, would serve as the foundation for a better future. I invited him in, and he followed, his steps hesitant. The apartment upstairs, my new home, would now be the stage for our reconciliation. I sat him on the sofa and, looking into his eyes, I began to lay out my plan. I used my resources to pay off his debts, but I set clear conditions, not as a punishment, but as a path to his redemption. "You're going to work for me," I began, my voice calm but unwavering. "You'll learn the real estate business from the ground up. You'll see how every brick is laid with sweat and honesty. And above all, you will prove that you deserve a second chance in life." He didn't hesitate, accepting every word with a humility he had never shown before. It was a new beginning for him and for us. The road would be long and arduous, but the bridge to redemption was being built, and I, his father, would be there to help him cross it. The future, which had once seemed dark and uncertain, now opened with a thread of hope. The journey was just beginning, and I knew that his transformation would be my greatest victory. The days following our reconciliation were marked by a strange quiet in the apartment, a respectful silence that seemed to heal the open wounds in our relationship. My son, once a hurricane of ambition and impulsiveness, now moved with a newfound humility, his steps lighter, his words more considered. He began to work with me, initially as an apprentice, a silent observer. I took him to construction sites, to meetings with tenants, to appointments with suppliers. At first, he seemed like a fish out of water, his eyes scanning blueprints and budgets with a perplexity that revealed how detached he had been from the reality of our business. But he was willing to learn, and that was what mattered most. Every day was a lesson. I taught him about the importance of each brick, each beam, not just as construction material, but as the foundation of a home, an investment, a secure future. I spoke about business ethics, about the trust that is built over time, about the importance of keeping one's word and valuing every person involved in the process, from the mason to the architect. He listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, his features showing a genuine interest I hadn't seen in him for years. This was the true second chance, not just for him, but for our relationship. It was what I had secretly wished for, the opportunity to rebuild the bonds that greed had almost destroyed forever. His presence by my side was a constant reminder of the tortuous path that had led him here. I saw in his eyes the shame of the past, but also the determination to redeem himself. He didn't shy away from the most menial tasks, nor complain about the long hours. On the contrary, he seemed eager to absorb every piece of knowledge, every piece of advice. Manny, who had witnessed the entire saga, watched him with a look of silent approval. Mrs. Rosa, ever attentive to the building's goings-on, commented to me on the remarkable change in his behavior, which filled me with a quiet pride. His reputation in the neighborhood, which had plummeted, was beginning to be rebuilt brick by brick, just like the buildings we constructed. One afternoon, as we were reviewing some old rental agreements, he paused, his gaze fixed on one of the documents. "Dad, this apartment here," he began, his voice hesitant. It was the apartment he had tried to steal, the one that had been the bait in my trap. I felt a chill. "What about it, son?" I asked, bracing myself for what was to come. He looked up, and in his eyes was a mixture of guilt and a new understanding. "I was looking at the paperwork, and I noticed that the debt you took out on it is much larger than the property's value. And the date of the mortgage. It was before I even asked you to sign. You already knew, didn't you? Silence filled the room. The sun, streaming through the window, seemed to freeze in the air. My eyes met his, and there was no accusation in his gaze, only a somber curiosity and a hint of newfound respect. It was the moment of truth, the instant when the entirety of my plan would be revealed. He had figured it out on his own, through hard work and attention to detail, the depth of my strategy. There was no hiding it anymore. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decisions, but also the certainty that I had done the right thing. "Yes, son," I replied, my voice a little deeper than usual. "I knew. I sensed her intentions, and I sensed your weakness. I had to protect you, even if it meant letting you fall first." The full revelation, the meticulous plan of a trap that seemed like a betrayal, was now exposed. His gaze deepened, and I could see him grasping the magnitude of what I had done, not as a punishment, but as a desperate act of love. That was the true turning point, the moment when trust, once broken, began to be rebuilt on a more solid and honest foundation, paving the way for a new and unexpected stage of our journey. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and silent. My son's expression was a complex tapestry of shock, shame, and, surprisingly, a glimmer of admiration. The stark truth about my strategy, about how I had woven a web to catch them in their own greed, was now undeniable. He had seen the documents, the date of the mortgage, the proof that I was aware of the danger long before he bowed to his girlfriend's manipulation. I watched his face, each line of tension gradually relaxing, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The silence was a testament to the magnitude of that revelation, a moment of transition in our relationship. There was no anger in his eyes, nor the old arrogance, just a deep understanding of how far I had gone to protect him, even if the method seemed cruel at first glance. "So, you were expecting this, weren't you?" he said, his voice almost a whisper, with no hint of accusation, just a statement of fact. It was an acknowledgement of my cunning side, the one he had so disdained in the past, but which had now saved him. I nodded, and he lowered his gaze to his hands, seeming to absorb the full weight of the information. The apartment, once the symbol of his supposed victory, now revealed itself as the tool of his greatest lesson. The massive debt I had placed upon it was not just a financial burden, but a mirror, reflecting the disillusionment of his greedy dreams and the betrayal of the one he trusted. In that moment, he finally saw the extent of the trap she had set, and my intervention, however painful, now seemed like an act of love. In the following days, we delved even deeper into the intricacies of the real estate business. My confession didn't diminish his drive. On the contrary, he seemed more determined than ever to learn, to make up for lost time, and to prove his worth. I took him everywhere, teaching him not only about numbers and contracts, but about the art of negotiation, of reading people, of identifying the true intentions behind false smiles. I saw him absorb every word, his eyes shining with a new intelligence, the astuteness I always knew he possessed, but which had been dormant, suffocated by arrogance. He began to show a flair for business, an ability to identify opportunities and risks that surprised me every day. It was like seeing a younger, better version of myself, devoid of the blind ambition that had driven him to rock bottom. Conversations with the neighbors grew warmer. Mrs. Rosa, ever the perceptive observer, commented one day, "Mr. Anthony, your son is a different young man. It's a pleasure to see the change." Manny, the superintendent, who maintained an almost unbreakable air of seriousness, surprised me with a smile and a nod of approval when he saw me with my son in the lobby. It was clear that his transformation was not only noticeable to me, but to the entire community. He had regained respect, not with money or property, but with humility and hard work. It was a victory for him and an indescribable joy for me. However, there was still an element of mystery that hung in the air. The girlfriend. Despite all the signs that she had disappeared, leaving a trail of debt and broken hearts, I felt that her story was not over. A part of me, the old cunning that never slept, was on alert, sensing that something was still to come. I had protected my son from financial ruin, but the con artist's shadow still loomed over us, a veiled threat that I couldn't ignore. I knew that for the healing to be complete, the wound she had caused needed to be fully exposed and treated. The end of this journey was not yet in sight, and the next revelation, I felt, would be crucial to the outcome of our story, and I was ready to face whatever came alongside my son, now stronger and wiser. The daily routine of working alongside my son became a comforting rhythm, a balm for the wounds that betrayal had left. Every morning, when I met him, I saw not just the figure of a young man seeking redemption, but the promise of a future where our relationship would be built on a more solid and transparent foundation. He dedicated himself with a fervor I had never witnessed before, diving into the details of contracts, cost spreadsheets, and the complexities of real estate law. His questions were sharp, his observations often surprising me with their intelligence. This was the son I always knew he could be, awakened by a painful but necessary fall. While he learned the ins and outs of the business, I quietly dedicated myself to monitoring the trail of the woman who had deceived us. My intuition, forged in years of tough negotiations and dealing with all sorts of people, told me she hadn't simply vanished without leaving loose ends. This woman was meticulous in her plans, and the speed with which she disappeared, taking the watch and the money, left me with a nagging suspicion. I asked my lawyer, a trusted man I've worked with for decades, to discreetly investigate her whereabouts. Knowing the seriousness of the matter, he began a quiet search, and without raising suspicion, I wanted to understand the extent of the scam, the other names involved, and perhaps find a way to recover what belonged to my son, especially his mother's watch. The days turned into weeks, and my son's recovery was evident to everyone. He had lost some weight, but his eyes had regained their shine, his posture had straightened, and he exhibited a new confidence, not the arrogance of the past, but a self-assurance built on learning and humility. Our conversations, once filled with uncomfortable silences, now flowed naturally, covering not just business, but life, memories of his mother, and dreams for the future. It was as if the crisis had forced us to reconnect on a deeper level, to see each other not just as father and son, but as friends and confidants. He expressed genuine remorse for his actions, and I saw in his eyes the pain of regret, which assured me that he was truly changing. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. His voice, usually calm and professional, was tinged with a tone of urgency. "Mr. Anthony, I've found a few things. It seems Miss X, your son's girlfriend, hasn't completely disappeared. She's operating in another city, but under a false name. And the pattern is the same. Older men, properties, debts. It looks like she's part of a larger network." The revelation took me by surprise, but confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't just a lone scammer. She was a link in a chain, a piece on a much larger board. My lawyer's information revealed she had an accomplice, a man who appeared to be the mastermind behind all the scams, someone with an even more cunning mind than hers. The name of one of the accomplices, a man known in the criminal underworld as an expert in document forgery, was also mentioned. The news filled me with a mixture of indignation and a strange determination. This woman was not just a traitor, but a criminal, and my son had been one of her victims, albeit through his own blindness. I needed to dig deeper, not only to recover what was lost, but to expose the network and ensure that other families didn't suffer the same fate. The path to true justice, I realized, was longer than I had imagined, and now involved not just financial recovery, but the dismantling of a fraud ring. The revelation that she was part of something bigger, with a mastermind and accomplices, made the situation more complex and, at the same time, more urgent. My son's arc of suffering, I knew, would only be fully healed when the complete truth came to light, and those responsible were confronted, and I was ready to fight for it. The news that the con artist was part of a larger network with a mastermind and accomplices ignited a new fire in me. It was no longer just a personal matter, a lesson for my son. It was a fight for justice, an opportunity to protect other families from the same pain as ours. My business acumen, which had allowed me to build an empire from nothing, would now be employed for a greater purpose, to unmask a fraud ring. I felt a responsibility not only to my son, but to all those who could be the next victims. My wife's gold watch, which he had lost, became a symbol of this mission, a constant reminder that what was stolen needed to be recovered and the guilty held accountable. I kept the information about the network a secret from my son for the time being. He was on such an important path to recovery, learning to rebuild his life with honesty and hard work, that I didn't want to overwhelm him with the complexity and dangers of a criminal investigation. However, I began to involve him without his knowledge in tasks that would aid my own investigation. I asked him to research properties that had recently been sold in a neighboring city under the pretext of identifying new investment opportunities. With his new dedication, he dove into the data, never suspecting that he was actually helping me map the con artist's pattern of operation. My conversations with the lawyer became more frequent and secretive. He provided me with details about the network's new victims, the stories repeating with a calculated coldness, elderly people deceived, families torn apart, assets drained. The indignation grew within me, transforming the sadness of betrayal into a steely determination. The network's mastermind, according to the information, was a man of great influence who operated in the shadows, using front men and sophisticated tactics to avoid detection. He was the true brain behind it all, the master manipulator who profited from the naivety and greed of others. One day, my son approached me with a binder of documents. "Dad, I was analyzing the records of these properties you asked me to look into in the next town over. I noticed a strange pattern. They were all bought from elderly people, and most were mortgaged right after the purchase with massive debts. It's very similar to what happened with our apartment." He looked at me, his eyes fixed on mine, a gradual understanding dawning on his face. His instinct, sharpened by his own experience, was beginning to detect the scheme. It was a crucial moment, the instant I had to decide whether to tell him the whole truth or continue to protect him. Silence filled the office. I could feel the tension in the air, the expectation in his gaze. He was connecting the dots, realizing that the investment opportunity I had presented was actually an investigation. "You're right, son," I said, my voice calm but laced with a gravity he recognized. "It's no coincidence. This is the same woman who deceived you, and she's part of something much bigger. She's just a piece in a network of con artists that's exploiting older people and their families." His expression shifted from surprise to anger, then to a cold determination. He wasn't scared, but indignant. The experience of being a victim had strengthened him, transforming his naivety into a sense of justice. "So, what are we going to do, Dad?" he asked, his voice firm, his eyes shining with a renewed purpose. In that moment, I knew he was ready. He was no longer the boy who needed saving, but a man willing to fight for a greater cause. The decision to actively involve him in the investigation, to expose him to the whole truth, was a risk, but one I was willing to take. I needed his intelligence, his perspective, and above all, I needed him to understand the true extent of the evil we had faced. It was the next step in his journey of overcoming, and the beginning of our own quest for justice. A quest that promised to unearth even deeper and more dangerous truths. The inclusion of my son in the investigation was a turning point. He didn't just accept the challenge, he embraced it with a passion and a sense of purpose that filled me with pride. It was as if the pain of his own experience had forged him into a warrior, a defender of those who, like him, had fallen victim to manipulation and greed. Our meetings with the lawyer became more frequent, and my son proved to be a sharp analyst, connecting dots that I sometimes missed. His hunger for justice was a fire that burned brightly, and I felt that together we were an unstoppable force. We discovered that the network operated with terrifying sophistication. The mastermind, a man known only as the Architect, was a master of social engineering, able to identify the emotional and financial vulnerabilities of his victims. He exploited family trust, the ambition of children, and the naivety of the elderly to orchestrate his scams. The women, like the one who deceived my son, were merely the fronts, the executors of his diabolical plans. The anger my son felt for the woman who manipulated him began to shift towards the true mind behind the operation, which was an important step in his healing process. Our investigations led us to a shocking revelation. The Architect was no complete stranger. He had been an old business associate of my late partner, a man I had implicitly trusted for years. The discovery left me shaken. The betrayal now extended into a distant past, revealing a web of deceit that had taken root long before I could have imagined. I went through my old files, documents from years ago, and found subtle clues that, at the time, made no sense, but now fit perfectly into the puzzle. He had always been nearby, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The revelation about the Architect brought a deeper layer of mystery to the surface. He not only targeted properties, but also collected items of sentimental value from his victims, like trophies of his conquests. It was then that a light went on in my mind. His mother's gold watch. It hadn't been stolen merely for its monetary value. It was a symbol, a personal touch, a mark of his victory. This man wasn't just a criminal, he was a psychopath. This discovery intensified our search, turning it into a rescue mission, not just for material possessions, but for memories and a sense of justice. My son, upon learning of the Architect's connection to my past, felt a mix of shock and a renewed sense of urgency. He remembered my father's old partner, a man who had seemed so upstanding, but was, in fact, a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Dad, we have to stop this man. He can't keep doing this to other families," he said, his voice choked with emotion, but his eyes fixed on me with determination. It was the voice of a son who had found his purpose, a man who had risen from the ashes of his own ruin to become a champion. We deepened our strategy. My lawyer suggested that the most effective path would be to gather irrefutable evidence and present it to the authorities, ensuring the case wouldn't be ignored. We needed more than circumstantial evidence. We needed concrete proof, testimonies from other victims, financial trails that led directly to the Architect. The tension mounted, but so did our unity. Every day was a battle, but we fought it side by side, father and son, united by a greater cause. I felt that the climax was approaching, the moment when the network would be dismantled and justice would be served. And on that day, I knew that the true healing for our family would begin, not just financially but emotionally. The air of apprehension mixed with hope, and the future, once uncertain, now seemed to have a clear path. The days following the discovery of the Architect and his connection to my past were steeped in a quiet tension, like the calm before a storm. My son and I dove headfirst into the task of gathering the irrefutable proof we needed to unmask the network. Every hour was dedicated to tracking down documents, analyzing patterns in financial transactions, and investigating the testimonies of other victims whose stories, now understood in their entirety, broke my heart. My lawyer's office became our war room, a sanctuary of paperwork and cold coffee. where adrenaline and determination were the fuel that kept us awake late into the night. I saw the exhaustion in my son's eyes, but also a spark of purpose that had never shone so brightly. He, with his young and sharp mind, found patterns in the mortgages and sale dates that I, with my experience, had overlooked. His ability to connect the pieces, to see the intricate web the architect had woven, was remarkable. We spent hours hunched over bank statements, property records, and even social media profiles, trying to piece together the double life of the mastermind and his accomplices. With each new discovery, the outrage grew, and the certainty that we were on the right path drove us forward. The victims were always the most vulnerable. Elderly people with little financial literacy, families with ambitious children, lonely individuals searching for a connection. The tension escalated when we realized the architect seemed to be aware he was being investigated. Anonymous calls to the lawyer's office, emails with veiled threats, and even an unfamiliar car that began to circle our building for a few nights. It was a dangerous game, and I felt the weight of responsibility not only for my son's safety, but for my own. I remembered the times I had to be discreet in business to protect investments. Now it was my life and the lives of those I loved that were at stake. My son noticed the car and the change in my demeanor. "Dad, is everything okay? You seem more tense than usual," he asked one night. His voice soft, a touch of concern in his eyes. "We're getting closer, son, and when that happens, they get nervous," I replied, trying to sound calmer than I actually felt. The search for his mother's gold watch became a central point in our investigation. I wanted to recover it, not just for its material value, but as a symbol of our victory over greed and cruelty. The architect had a pattern of keeping a sentimental object from each scam, a macabre collection of trophies. Through one of the lawyer's informants, we learned that he kept these items in a secure location, a discreet apartment in a remote neighborhood that he used as a hideout and private office. It was the heart of his operation, where he kept not only his trophies, but also documentary evidence of all his scams. The most tense moment came when we received information that the architect would be traveling for a few days, leaving the apartment empty. It was our chance, but also our greatest risk. We couldn't go alone. We needed a plan, and we needed the help of the authorities. The decision on how to proceed was intensely debated. My lawyer, a cautious man, argued that we should just hand the information over to the police and let them do the rest. But I felt we needed more, something to connect them undeniably, and the architect's apartment was the key. My son, to my surprise, agreed with me. "Dad, if we don't go after that evidence, he might get away with it. We have to be sure," he said, his eyes burning with a determination that reminded me of myself in my prime. We prepared a strategy with the lawyer to alert the police to the hideout's location, but ensuring they would only enter after we had confirmed the presence of the crucial documents and the watch. It would be a calculated risk, a bold but necessary move. The appointed night arrived, and the air was charged with an almost palpable electricity. I looked at my son, his eyes shining in the darkness of the car as we approached the address. The moment of greatest tension was about to unfold. Our fate was in their hands, and the future of our family, and many others, depended on this single, dangerous, and decisive step. The night of the operation arrived cloaked in a cold, dense fog that hugged the city, adding an extra layer of suspense to our mission. The streets were eerily quiet, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. In the passenger seat, my son was tense, but his eyes, once filled with fear and insecurity, now shone with an unshakable determination. He had become a different man, forged in the fire of adversity, and I felt an immense pride in having witnessed his transformation. We knew we were about to face the greatest challenge of our journey, and the imminent danger was a shadow that hung over us. We arrived at the remote neighborhood where the architect's hideout was located, a discreet and harmless-looking place. The building, an old one with a faded facade, seemed to swallow the night's light, and the atmosphere was heavy, laden with secrets. My lawyer had provided us with detailed information about the apartment, including the floor and the likely location of the evidence. The plan was simple. Get in, locate the documents and the watch, and then signal the police, who would be on standby, awaiting our call. The risk was calculated, but it existed. Any mistake could compromise not only the operation, but also our safety. With the keys our lawyer had obtained through an informant, we entered the building, our footsteps echoing in the silent lobby. The elevator, old and creaky, took us to the desired floor with agonizing slowness. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could feel my son's ragged breath beside me. When we arrived, the architect's apartment door seemed more imposing than usual, a portal to the conclusion of our story. I inserted the key, and with a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a dark and dusty interior, permeated with the smell of mildew and guarded secrets. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the faint light coming from the street. We turned on our phone flashlights and began to search the place. It was a simple apartment, but with cabinets and boxes stacked high, suggesting a life of accumulation and concealment. My son, with an agility that surprised me, started searching the living room, while I focused on the makeshift office. With every drawer opened, every box rummaged through, the tension mounted. Time was running out, and the possibility of being discovered was a constant worry. Finally, in a secret drawer of an old desk, we found what we were looking for, a thick folder filled with detailed documents on every scam, names, dates, amounts, the irrefutable proof. And next to it, wrapped in a silk scarf, was his mother's gold watch, gleaming under the flashlight beam. Emotion washed over me. I picked up the watch, feeling the weight of its history in my hands. My son came over, and when he saw the watch, his eyes filled with tears. It was more than an object. It was the restoration of a memory, a symbol of his mother and the love she represented. In that moment, as I held the watch and my son hugged me, tears streaming down his face, I felt that all the sacrifices, all the pain, had been worth it. We signaled the police, who arrived in minutes, storming the apartment and securing the evidence. The operation was a success. The fraud ring would be dismantled, and the architect would finally be held accountable for his actions. I looked at my son, who had been through so much, and saw in his eyes not just relief, but a new strength, a deep understanding of what true justice and the true value of love and family were. The main conflicts were resolved, the narrative arc set for a conclusion. But most importantly, our relationship had been rebuilt, stronger and more genuine than ever. The journey had been arduous, but the end promised a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The aftermath of the operation was a whirlwind of emotions and bureaucracy. In the following days, the architect and his accomplices were arrested and the fraud ring was dismantled. The police, armed with the irrefutable evidence we had collected, managed to unravel the web of scams that stretched across several cities, protecting countless families from future suffering. My son and I were called in to give our statements, and every word spoken at the station was another step toward justice and our own healing. His mother's gold watch, now safe in my hands, was a constant reminder of the pain overcome and the victory won. News of the arrests spread quickly, and the victims who had once lived in the silent fear and shame began to come forward, seeking support and sharing their stories. My son, with his new perspective, volunteered to help these people, offering his time and knowledge to assist them in recovering what they had lost. He became a tireless advocate, an example that overcoming adversity isn't just about getting back on your feet, but about extending a hand to those who are still on the ground. I watched him, my heart overflowing with a pride that no fortune could buy. 3 weeks after that fateful dinner, we walked together through the hallways of our building. The apartment that was once the epicenter of betrayal now stood empty, a silent reminder of a dark chapter we had overcome. My son, standing tall with a genuine smile on his lips, held the key to the apartment he had stolen, no longer with the arrogance of before, but with the humility of someone who had learned a valuable lesson. He had decided, on his own, to sell the property to completely pay off the remaining debts and invest the rest in a fund to help other scam victims, a gesture that moved me deeply. He learned that true wealth isn't stolen, it's built with hard work, honesty, and respect. It wasn't just about money, it was about integrity, about character, about the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of the man you've become. And I, in turn, learned that sometimes, to save the ones we love, we have to let them fall first so they can rise up stronger. The pain of the process was immense, but the transformation I saw in my son was the greatest reward. Our relationship, once fragile and full of resentment, had been fortified in a way I never imagined, becoming an unbreakable bond of love, trust, and mutual respect. Today, sitting on the balcony of my upstairs apartment, with the city view stretching out before us as the sun sets on the horizon, I listen to him talk about his plans, his ideas for expanding our business ethically and transparently. He has become my right-hand man, my successor not only in assets, but in the values I've always upheld. I look at him and see not just my son, but a man I can fully trust, someone who understands that love and family are the greatest assets we possess. The journey was long and arduous, marked by moments of pain, betrayal, and fear. But with every obstacle, we discovered a strength we didn't know we had. The story of the apartment, the debt, and the manipulation became a cautionary tale, but also one of hope. It taught us that even in the darkest of times, human resilience and the power of family love can overcome any adversity. The outcome was not just the resolution of a conflict, but the rebirth of a family, more united and wiser than ever. My son, once a victim of his own greed, is now an example of resilience. And I, the father who risked everything to save him, have found the peace and joy of seeing him walk a path of light. And so, our story continues, a testament that love, family, and justice will always prevail.